Greetings. In this segment, we are going to explore the roots of social work in the U.S. As a field, social work has been shaped by history, and social work practice has evolved in reaction to changing conditions and policies in the U.S. But as a field, social worker perspectives have also helped to shape the future direction of policy and transformed history in ways that have changed lives and communities. And so in the rest of this module, we're going to be exploring the role of history in social work and social welfare. This segment also builds on the very first MOOC that some of you may have taken that explored social work generally, but we'll expand by going a little bit more into depth about history and especially the roots of social work history. However, like we did in the first MOOC, we're going to want you to develop a historical lens, and this lens takes stock of history and policy as a part of social work practice. It requires us to ask questions about what were the historical conditions that gave rise to issues, and how does policy shape social work practice, and how will what we are as a field doing today shape the future of U.S. history and policy. Before we start, I want to spend a little bit of time acknowledging that this will be a very brief history and that there's much more history that we're not able to touch on, but that we'll be providing resources at the end of this module if you want to explore further. I also want to acknowledge that this section is heavily influenced by Janet Finn, a social work scholar at the University of Montana, and her 2016 book called Just Practice, and also will be acknowledged at the end of this section if you'd like to go look at her book further. So as we start, we want to think about the importance of history. So again, drawing from Professor Janet Finn's book, Just Practice, she articulates the importance of history in a few ways. First, as a warning. So history can remind us or it can alert us to past challenges, past injustices, and history often repeats itself, so learning from the past can help inform us for the future. Second, as a building block for ideas. There is a phrase in community organizing that we stand on the shoulders of others. And using that kind of phrase, history is an opportunity for us to learn from the past in order to generate ideas and take them forward. Third, as a way to see power. So when we explore history, we can see how power was used, both to control people and also to oppress people, but also to see how power can be organized and harnessed by people for change, such as during mass movements for civil rights. And last, as an inspiration. In that way, exploring history can remind us that change is possible and that despite situations, people can and do work together for change. So we'll start this lecture by first thinking about the early influences and the roots of social welfare. So there are many roots of social work and social welfare in the U.S., and some of the scholars talk about them as kind of pre-history foundations. And so I want to spend a little bit of time kind of thinking through those. First, it's important to think about the idea of social welfare and just reminding around the definition of this as it's a concern for the well-being of people, as a concept that's been developed over time and has been influenced by policy, perspectives, and practices that were fundamentally rooted in issues of privilege and oppression. So most social work scholars highlight that those privileged in society created the rules and practices that laid the roots for U.S. social welfare. And often these policies and practices were rooted in ideas about who they thought were worthy of help and who conformed to their values, beliefs, and ideas. And those that weren't considered worthy of help or weren't people that would conform to their values, beliefs, or ideas were often seen as unworthy or less deserving of help. And policies were developed in ways that cut them out or excluded them from receiving supports and services. And sometimes, historically, that was people were seemed unworthy or less deserving of help because of their religion or their racial background or other characteristics. And so it's really important as we think about the kind of roots of social welfare history that we take a critical lens to thinking about why and how policies were created, and that it wasn't just that they came into being, but that they really were rooted in a set of assumptions and set of biases and set of perspectives. And again, much of the U.S. social welfare system was also built on a Western, European, Judeo-Christian model that also really excluded other kinds of knowing, such as knowing and community welfare practices that existed in indigenous communities. So we're going to start by taking a look at some of these policies and practices that influenced the U.S. system. So drawing from Finn's work, she classified 4 rough foundations to the U.S. social welfare system. The first she talked about is mutual aid. And this concept of mutual aid is really people taking care of their own. And you start to see this concept of mutual aid going all the way back to the Middle Ages, where you start to see the rise of religious institutions and churches and other types of community institutions that were taking care of their own. And what's important about this idea of kind of taking care of their own is where you start to see this set of assumptions and biases kind of being built into social welfare practice in terms of who these institutions considered to be their own and who they didn't. And so you started to see policies and practices that reflected a preference for people who worked hard or who shared a common religion, and those were who received mutual aid. So this concept grew over time, and as we move into kind of the 1500s to the 1700s, you started to see a series of laws that codified help and started to think about that in terms of through laws. And probably the most well-recognized set of laws was the creation of the Elizabethan Poor Laws. And these are often seen as the foundation, again, for early social welfare policy. And these laws began to process and think about who deserved help. And they set into a set of codes about who was worthy of help, which often were women and children, sometimes the elderly, and created kind of a set of categories of people who were less deserving of help. And so you start to see these kind of put into practices as to who was able to receive support and who wasn't. The time period of the 1700s to the 1800s saw the creation of institutions that were designed to help people and to create places to put people that needed help or needed support. And sometimes these were people who society deemed as needing to be reformed. And so you start to see the rise of prisons and mental asylums and orphanages. And while this may have been seen at the time by society as a way to help, often these institutions really created more harm. Many poor and unskilled, mentally ill people again who were excluded because of their religion or because of other social identity characteristics ended up in these institutions. And many social work scholars view the rise of these systems and practices, again, as being built on that set of values and morals that were aimed to regulate people's choices and people's agency, and again, got built into the fabric of U.S. social welfare moving forward. And so while many of the systems and policies and practices, early policies and practices were kind of embedded in these concepts of values and morals and ideas, they're also, historically, one of the foundations has been the rise of people to step forward and to challenge those institutions and fight for their rights and to work for reforms. And so you start to see in the late 1800s and the early 1900s a rise of movements to fight for the rights of women, for workers, for ending slavery, for African Americans in the period post-Civil War in the U.S. And in many ways, these become the basic foundations for where the social work institution, social work profession came into being. So social work emerged in the late 19th and 20th centuries, again, as the result of changing conditions. Again, this was in part a response to the challenges facing families and individuals as a result of industrialization, the rise of immigration, and the rapid growth of urban cities as people moved from a more farming and agricultural society into cities and changing the political and economic landscape in the post-Civil War era. These forces created situations in which families were living in unsafe and crowded tenements, where they lacked sanitation and safe water, where there was a high level of poverty, hunger, health issues, and where there was almost no connection, for at least formal connection, to education or social supports. In addition, jobs were very unsafe and had little regulation. Children and adults from poor families often worked very long hours and hard labor jobs with no protection. Prior to the Civil War, there were very little organized social services in the United States in response to these growing needs. And so social work as a profession and as a practice really emerged as individuals and organizations tried to address these issues, provide support to families, and develop solutions for change. So what were some of the major influences in the creation of U.S. social work? So generally speaking, most social work historians trace the roots of formal organized social work into two kind of major movements: the Charity Organization Society and the settlement house movements. And both of these efforts were based off of models that came from Britain and Europe as strategies to provide social welfare and to support and to address the needs and issues that were emerging in this kind of post-industrial society. But they had different approaches and philosophies. So in the next little bit, we're going to spend some time learning about them.